Greetings. Today I would like to talk a little bit about a type of musical piece, the waltz. The word waltz refers to both the musical composition and to the dance that goes with it. However, for the purposes of this presentation, I will mostly focus on talking about the former rather than the later. There are three questions that I will be addressing during the presentation. Firstly, what is a waltz? And what are some of its main characteristics? Secondly, what are the origins of the waltz? And lastly, what are some of the most well-known waltzes created throughout history, which are still played today? As I have already alluded to, a waltz is a type of musical composition that is made for dancing. It is very popular in Austrian, German, and French cultures, and was one of the most used types of pieces in ballroom dances throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Today, waltzes are still commonly played in various formal events. To briefly describe the formal characteristics of a waltz, it is always composed in 3/4 times. It only uses one chord per measure, and each measure uses a repeating pattern of quarter notes, where the first beat is the root of the chord and the second and third beat play the chord. To those without some knowledge about musical composition, this may sound like jargon, but it is the conjunction of these characteristics that give a waltz its unique feeling that can be identified even by those without extensive musical knowledge. To make them simpler to understand, I will explain them in a little bit more of detail. Music is divided into small units of time called measures. Each measure contains a certain number of beats. The 3/4 time signature means that each measure contains 3 beats. The way in which you can identify this group of 3 beats when listening to waltz is that the first beat has greater emphasis. There are other types of compositions, such as minuets, that also prominently feature the 3/4 time. What makes waltzes markedly different is its chord structure. A chord is a group of notes that accompany the main melody and harmonize with it. In a waltz, each measure has a single chord. However, the chord is split into 3 parts, matching the 3 beats of the melody. On the first beat, only the lowest note of the chord is played. This note is the one upon which the chord is constructed, and is called the root of the chord. On the second and third beats, the whole chord other than the root is played. This creates a very clear 1-2-3 pattern that repeats itself throughout the piece. This is the basic structure of any waltz. Of course, there is a lot of room for variation, which is what makes each piece distinct. But the use of these core elements is what makes the essence of a waltz, and makes it identifiable as such, even by listeners who aren't intimately familiar with music theory. Regarding the origins of this type of musical composition, in the beginning it was deeply tied to the dance of the same name. Although today we may think of it as something glamorous, the origins of this dance were quite humble. It emerged as an Austrian folk dance, possibly at some point during the 16th century. The word waltz comes from the German word waltzen, which means to turn. This is likely related to the way in which waltz is danced, which involve rapid turning movements. All in all, the waltz is a very simple dance, involving only a few easy-to-learn steps. This made the waltz very different from other contemporary dances which involve complex choreographies. Although it may surprise some now, the waltz was a very controversial type of dance back in its day. On one hand, it was looked down upon by the elites for its simplicity, and some even considered it a danger to the art form. It was also criticized for how intimate it was compared to other contemporary dances. Both partners always stood in close proximity to each other. Despite initially being looked at with disdain by the elites, they eventually not only accepted it, but also fully embraced it. By the 19th century, the waltz had reached a peak of its popularity. It was immensely popular in Austria, Germany, and France, and several famous composers such as Franz Schubert were dedicating their time to writing new pieces. It was around this time period that the waltz, as a musical composition, started to gain some independence from the ballroom dance and began taking shape as a musical genre. Hundreds of waltzes were composed by famous musicians, many of which were made for piano solos. This meant that people could now dance to waltzes on their own homes instead of having to assist a ballroom. The culmination of this process was the work of Frederick Chopin. During his time as a composer, he wrote 18 waltzes for solo piano that were not meant for dancing. Many of them had characteristics that make them very pleasant to listen to, but rather hard to dance to, such as a very fast rhythm, and thus the waltz as a music genre was born. Throughout the 19th century, the waltz continued to develop as a genre and more composers started delving into it. Johannes Brahms, Johann Strauss, Maurice Ravel, Igor Stravinsky, and many others continued to expand upon the genre throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Although today is nowhere near as popular as it once was, there are still modern composers who continue to make new waltzes. There are many waltzes that are well known today, and out of them, the Blue Danube might be one of the most famous. It was composed by Johann Strauss in 1866. Its moderately slow tempo and merry tune make it a popular choice for formal dances. It also has been prominently featured in pop culture, such as in Stanley Kubrick's film 2001: A Space Odyssey. Although its name may not be quite as recognizable, Chopin's Waltz No. 1 in E flat is so well known that most people will recognize it upon hearing it. This was the first waltz composed by Chopin in the early 1830s. With its fast tempo and high energy, the virtuosity of this piece shows that it was clearly meant for more pianists to demonstrate their skill rather than for people to dance to it. The many waltzes all sound very different from each other, and La Valse written by Maurice Ravel in 1919 showcases this very well. At first, it might even be hard to tell that it's a waltz at all. It uses a lot of low growling sounds and dissonant chords that give it a jarring feeling. And even though throughout most of it, the basic structure of a waltz is identifiable, each part of the piece conveys a very different feeling and character. This concludes my presentation about the waltz. This musical composition has a really interesting history behind it, and at least in my opinion, it is fascinating to see how it has grown and evolved throughout time, and how it still remains relevant in modern times, more than a century past the peak of its popularity.